Most people don't think of clouds of asbestos when they picture a small mountain, no town in Montana, but that's exactly what happened in Libby. A place that looked quiet and peaceful on the outside, but underneath the surface was hiding one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. This wasn't just some factory spill or short-term issue. What happened in Libby stretched across decades, poisoned the air, the soil, and even the water, and changed thousands of lives forever. It all started back in the early 1900s, when settlers arrived in the area. The mountains surrounding Libby were rich with minerals, and the discovery of a shiny, flaky mineral called vermiculite in the year 1919 quickly turned Libby into a busy mining town. Vermiculite might not sound exciting, but it was a big deal. When heated, it expanded and became light and fluffy, making it perfect for everything from insulation to soil conditioners, even packaging material. By the time the 1960s rolled around, Libby's mine was producing around 80% of the world's vermiculite, but there was a hidden danger buried in that shiny mineral. Mixed in with the vermiculite was a naturally occurring and deadly form of asbestos known as tremolite actinolite. Now, asbestos isn't dangerous when it's untouched, but once it's disturbed, like it would be in a mine, the tiny fibers become airborne. If those fibers get into the lungs, they can cause serious illnesses like asbestosis, lung cancer, and a rare but aggressive cancer called mesothelioma. The thing is, these diseases don't show up right away. It can take decades for symptoms to appear, which made it even harder for people to understand what was happening to them. In the early years, people in Libby had no idea they were breathing in anything dangerous. They just knew there was always a lot of dust. The mine sat just outside town, and that dust would drift into the streets, homes, schools, and playgrounds. Workers came home from long shifts with their clothes and skin coated in gray powder, hugging their families and spreading asbestos fibers unknowingly. Children played on contaminated fields, and some families even used leftover vermiculite from the mine for landscaping or insulation. Nobody warned them. Nobody told them the truth. The company that first mined vermiculite in Libby was Zonolite. They had started operations in the 1920s and kept growing bigger. But by the year 1963, a larger company called W.R. Grace & Company had taken over, and that's when the real tragedy started to unfold. By then, workers were already getting sick. Internal reports from as early as the mid-1960s showed that the company was tracking employee health issues. One report even listed names of employees with abnormal chests, a quiet way of noting severe lung problems. Many of those workers would later die of lung disease. Despite all this, nothing was done. The mine kept operating. People in town kept living with the dust. And even when someone got suspicious and asked questions about the so-called dust disease, they were usually brushed off. Some were told the mine only had tremolite, not realizing that tremolite was one of the deadliest forms of asbestos. One miner even remembered feeling completely blindsided when he found that out, saying, "We're not geologists. Nobody up on that hill knew what tremolite meant." The truth stayed buried for decades, and while the mine finally shut down in the year 1990, the damage had already been done. By the late 1990s, an alarming number of people in Libby were getting sick, and local doctors started raising red flags. The town that once prided itself on hard work and natural beauty was now dealing with a full-blown health crisis, and that was just the beginning. As the years went by in Libby, Montana, life seemed to carry on like normal, but behind the quiet mountain town charm, a deadly threat was growing stronger every day. It wasn't just the miners who were breathing in dangerous asbestos dust. It was their families, neighbors, and anyone who lived nearby. As the mining trucks moved back and forth from the hills, a fine powdery dust blew through the streets, coated homes, and settled in yards. People walked through it, kids played in it, and no one realized just how toxic it really was. By the early 1960s, the mine in Libby was producing over 80% of the world's supply of vermiculite. The mineral was everywhere, used in homes, gardens, and buildings across the country. But this particular source of vermiculite had a hidden contaminant, tremolite actinolite, one of the most toxic forms of asbestos. Inhaling just a tiny amount of it could eventually cause serious illness, but that wasn't common knowledge at the time. Most residents thought the dust was just part of life in a mining town. Even worse, mine waste was often handed out to the public for free. It was used to line driveways, fill potholes, build playgrounds, and even as soil in community gardens. People thought it was a useful resource, never suspecting it was full of deadly asbestos fibers. Kids slid down piles of the dusty waste after school. Local businesses unknowingly tracked it inside on their shoes. Churches, schools, and backyards were built on top of contaminated land. As time passed, more and more people in Libby started to feel sick. The illnesses didn't hit right away. Sometimes it took decades for symptoms to show up. Many residents experienced shortness of breath, constant coughing, or unexplained fatigue. Some were diagnosed with rare diseases like mesothelioma or asbestosis, which are directly linked to asbestos exposure. And these weren't just old miners nearing retirement. Many were young, healthy people who had never stepped foot in the mine. Doctors in town began noticing patterns. Lung issues were popping up in people who had no other risk factors. Families were losing loved ones without understanding why. By the time most people got a diagnosis, there was little anyone could do to stop the damage. And still, no official warnings were issued to the public. For decades, there were no signs posted around town, no public announcements, no testing. People continued living, working, and raising families in an environment that was slowly poisoning them. And although there were hints that the company behind the mine, W.R. Grace & Company, was aware of the risks, they continued to keep quiet. Internal reports dating back to the mid-1960s mentioned abnormal chest x-rays in workers and rising concerns about lung disease, but nothing was shared with the public. It wasn't just about sickness. The emotional toll was massive. Families lost mothers, fathers, siblings, and children. Entire households were affected. People who had trusted their community's main employer now felt betrayed. They had been left in the dark for too long, and by the time help arrived, the damage had already spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Still, the full extent of the disaster hadn't come to light. At this point in the story, the town of Libby was dealing with growing health problems, a rising number of unexplained deaths, and no real answers from those in charge. But the worst part? Most of the country had never even heard of it. The story of Libby was about to change, just not in the way residents had hoped. In the late 1990s, the town of Libby was still suffering in silence. Decades had passed since the mine first opened, and by now, hundreds of people had either fallen ill or passed away. Yet outside of Montana, hardly anyone knew the town existed, let alone the slow-motion disaster happening there. That changed when a Seattle-based journalist named Andrew Schneider received a tip from a source about a small town dealing with a strange cluster of lung diseases. Schneider began digging. What he found shocked him. Medical records, internal company memos, and reports from former employees pointed to a major health crisis tied directly to asbestos exposure. In November of the year 2000, he published a series of articles in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer that exposed what had been hidden for so long. The headlines were blunt, the facts were horrifying, and finally the outside world was paying attention. The Environmental Protection Agency responded quickly. Within weeks, a team of EPA investigators arrived in Libby to begin testing soil, air, and even the insulation in homes. What they found confirmed Schneider's reporting: widespread contamination throughout the town. Even places that had no direct link to the mining site were testing positive for deadly asbestos fibers. This discovery led to one of the most aggressive environmental cleanup operations in U.S. history. The EPA declared Libby a public health emergency in the year 2009, the first time in its history that such a declaration was made for a single town. By then, thousands of residents had been exposed to dangerous levels of asbestos for decades. At the center of the crisis stood W.R. Grace & Company. As the owner of the mine, the company had long claimed it operated within the law, but internal documents now uncovered told a different story. Memos from as far back as the early 1970s mentioned concerns over dust levels, rising medical costs, and worker health problems. Some records even suggested efforts to downplay the risks or keep information from reaching the public. One of the most powerful voices to come forward during this time was a former mine manager named Robert Locke. He admitted under oath that he had been instructed to withhold certain safety information and had helped the company avoid drawing attention to the health hazards. His testimony became a key piece in the case that followed. In the year 2005, the United States Department of Justice indicted 7 current and former executives from W.R. Grace & Company. They were charged with conspiracy, fraud, and knowing endangerment. Prosecutors argued that the company had placed profits above lives, choosing silence over responsibility. The trial became a major national news story. People across the country were finally hearing the name Libby and understanding just how long its residents had suffered. Despite all the evidence and emotional testimony, the outcome of the trial surprised many. In the year 2009, all 7 individuals were acquitted of criminal charges. The jury found that the government had failed to prove that the men knowingly put lives at risk. While the legal case was over, the public outrage continued. For the people of Libby, the verdict felt like a second betrayal. But the exposure of the disaster had changed things. Federal aid began flowing into the town, medical screenings were expanded, cleanup crews were sent to remove contaminated insulation from homes, schools, and public buildings. And perhaps most importantly, the story of Libby forced a national conversation about the dangers of asbestos and the importance of environmental oversight. The damage, however, was already done. The physical toll couldn't be reversed, families had lost too much, and even as cleanup efforts began, residents had to live with the knowledge that their town would never be the same. After the criminal trial ended in the year 2009, the people of Libby were left to deal with the aftermath. While the verdict had disappointed many, the town's fight for justice wasn't over. Libby was now the focus of one of the largest and longest-running environmental cleanup efforts ever carried out by the United States government. Over the next decade, the Environmental Protection Agency worked to decontaminate schools, homes, parks, and businesses. Specialized crews removed tons of asbestos-contaminated soil, tore out old insulation, and replaced it with safer materials. It was a massive operation that took years, and it was only possible because the town had finally been heard. In addition to the physical cleanup, the federal government took a rare step. Congress passed legislation that gave Libby residents access to long-term health care. Under the Affordable Care Act, a special provision was added specifically for victims of the asbestos exposure in Libby. This made them eligible for federal benefits to help with medical costs, including treatment for asbestos-related diseases. It was a small but significant win for the community, proof that their voices had finally reached Washington. A local clinic, the Center for Asbestos-Related Disease, or CARD, became a lifeline for many families. Doctors there specialized in diagnosing and treating asbestos illnesses. They also helped gather data to better understand the long-term effects of the contamination. What they found was heartbreaking. People who had never worked in the mine, including children and spouses of miners, continued to show signs of illness. In some cases, the asbestos exposure came just from playing in a backyard or handling clothes covered in dust. These stories showed how far the contamination had spread and how deeply it had affected the town. Despite the progress, Libby faced another challenge: its identity. For years, the town had been defined by what happened there. News reports, documentaries, and books told the story of a place poisoned by asbestos. Tourism dropped, property values fell. Some residents moved away to escape the constant reminder of what had been lost, but others chose to stay and rebuild. They planted new gardens, restored old buildings, and created events to bring the community together again. Slowly, Libby began to shift from a story of tragedy to one of resilience. The local high school started teaching students about what had happened, not to dwell on the pain, but to ensure it was never forgotten. Public art projects were launched to honor the victims. One mural downtown shows a family standing strong together, surrounded by trees and mountains. It's a symbol of what Libby had endured and what it continues to overcome. Today, Libby is still recovering. Some places remain off limits due to lingering contamination, and for many, the health problems remain, but the town is no longer silent. It has become a case study for environmental justice, a reminder of what happens when profit is valued over safety and what it takes to fight back. The legacy of Libby lives on in court rulings, environmental policies, and medical research. It also lives on in the strength of its people. Their voices, once ignored, changed the law, forced government action, and brought national attention to an invisible killer. Libby's story is a hard one. It is full of loss, anger, and unanswered questions, but it is also a story of courage, of a small town that refused to be forgotten. June 8, 1917 dawned like any other day for the 415 men descending into the Granite Mountain and Speculator mines in Butte, Montana. Known as the richest hill on Earth, this copper-rich area fueled America's industrial engine, especially with World War I raging in Europe. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company, controlling most of the hill, operated around the clock to meet skyrocketing copper demand. Mines like Granite Mountain and Speculator were sprawling networks of tunnels where men labored under extreme conditions, digging deeper into the earth each day. The workforce was a diverse mix of 16 nationalities, including Irish, Finnish, Cornish, Italian, and Serbian immigrants, all drawn by the promise of steady wages. Life underground was grueling. Oppressive heat, dust-choked air, and the constant risk of cave-ins were daily hazards. The miners relied on the steel skip elevators to carry them 2,500 feet below the surface, fully aware that each descent was a gamble with their lives. Tension simmered beneath the routine, as unions had been weakened, and company pressure for wartime production outweighed concerns for safety. In this environment, the company planned a project to improve fire safety. A new sprinkler system that required lowering a massive oil-soaked, lead-sheathed cable down the Granite Mountain shaft. Ironically, this attempt at safety would unknowingly set the stage for the deadliest hard rock mining disaster in American history. The combination of high-stakes work, minimal oversight, and a complex, poorly understood underground environment created the conditions for catastrophe. It was a powder keg waiting for a single spark to ignite it. The safety project that was meant to protect the miners became the trigger for disaster. The massive 5-inch thick electric cable, designed to power the new sprinkler system, was being carefully lowered down the Granite Mountain shaft late on June 8, 1917. The cable, insulated with oil-soaked paper and wrapped in a lead sheath, slipped and fell nearly half a mile, landing in a tangled wreck at the 2,500-foot level. The fall tore the lead sheathing, exposing the highly flammable insulation inside. Assistant Foreman Ernest Sulau and a shift boss descended to inspect the damage, carrying standard carbide lamps, which produced open flames using acetylene gas. As Sulau leaned toward the mangled cable, his lamp came too close, igniting the oil-soaked insulation. In an instant, the fire shot up the cable like a fuse, engulfing the wooden support timbers of the shaft. The main ventilation system, designed to supply fresh air to the tunnels, now acted as a chimney, pulling smoke, superheated air, and deadly carbon monoxide into the interconnected Granite Mountain and Speculator mine tunnels. Panic spread immediately through the labyrinthine mine network. Workers deep underground had no warning or way to communicate with the surface or other parts of the mine. Every passage became a perilous trap, and the very system meant to keep them alive had turned into a conduit for poison. Within minutes, what began as a small spark had escalated into a life-threatening inferno that would claim 168 men before the ordeal ended. As the fire raged, the miners were trapped in a maze of tunnels that stretched thousands of feet beneath Butte. Thick black smoke and invisible carbon monoxide filled every passage, making each breath a struggle. Many men tried to escape, but the maze-like layout, combined with bulkheads that had never been fitted with emergency hatches, left them with almost no safe routes. Panic set in quickly. Some miners were forced to feel their way along walls, forming human chains in the suffocating darkness. A few groups took desperate measures to survive. Using rocks, timbers, and even scraps of clothing, they constructed makeshift bulkheads, packing them with mud to trap pockets of breathable air. Some miners stayed behind these barriers for hours, waiting in silence, hoping the fire would burn out or that rescuers would reach them. The air grew hotter and thinner as the fire consumed the shaft, and every passing minute increased the risk of suffocation. Communication lines to the surface had been destroyed by the flames, leaving rescuers unaware of who was still alive or where the survivors might be trapped. In these tunnels, courage and knowledge of the mine's layout became the difference between life and death. Every step forward was a gamble against smoke, heat, and disorientation. The tension was unbearable, as men realized that survival depended not on strength but on quick thinking, ingenuity, and sheer luck. Amid the smoke and searing heat, remarkable acts of bravery emerged. Magnus Duggan, a young tool boy known as a tunnel rat, led a group of 29 men into a dead-end tunnel to create a temporary safe zone. For 36 hours, they huddled together, conserving air and supporting each other as the fire roared above. Duggan guided 25 of his men to safety, but he never emerged himself, reportedly turning back into the smoke to fetch water or help for those left behind. Higher up in the tunnels, shift boss James D. Moore took a similar approach. He and 9 others barricaded themselves with available materials, surviving over 50 hours before being rescued. Moore reached the surface alive, but he later died from injuries sustained underground. Letters written on scraps of paper or directly on tunnel walls gave haunting insight into the miners' final thoughts. One miner scribbled, "All alive but air getting bad, one small piece of candle left, think it is all off." These messages remain a testament to human resilience in the face of overwhelming peril. The fire had turned the Granite Mountain and Speculator mines into a lethal trap, but ingenuity and courage allowed some to survive. Every decision was critical. One wrong step could have meant instant death. Even in the darkest corners of the mine, miners demonstrated extraordinary presence of mind, showing that survival often required calm under unimaginable pressure. This part of the disaster revealed not only the dangers of industrial negligence, but also the enduring strength of human spirit when confronted by life-threatening chaos. On the surface, Butte descended into grief and panic as news of the fire spread. Families rushed to the mine head, eyes straining toward the steel skip that would carry their loved ones up from the depths. Mine whistles sounded continuously, a mournful code signaling disaster that echoed across the city. Rescue efforts were harrowing. One early attempt sent a cage carrying 2 men directly into the flames, killing them instantly. Firefighters battled the blaze for 5 days before gaining any real control, while recovery operations stretched over 8 grueling days. Amid the destruction, a few miraculous survivals emerged from barricaded groups like those led by Magnus Dugan and James D. Moore. Sadly, for every man who escaped, dozens were found lifeless, suffocated by toxic fumes rather than burned. Rescuers discovered the bodies of 168 miners, most in tunnels or behind improvised bulkheads, a stark reminder of how quickly disaster had overtaken the underground labyrinth. The scene above and below ground revealed the human cost of industrial negligence. The city mourned, but the tragedy also sparked a reckoning. Workers and unions demanded accountability and safer conditions. The events left an indelible mark on Butte, shaping labor movements and industrial safety regulations for years to come. The Granite Mountain and Speculator disaster transformed Butte forever. Public outrage over the deaths of 168 men sparked strikes and the formation of the new Metal Mine Workers Union, demanding safer working conditions and fair treatment. Into this tense environment stepped Frank Little, a fiery organizer with the industrial workers of the world who condemned the prioritization of copper production over human life. His speeches galvanized miners, but also made him a target. On August 1st, 1917, less than 2 months after the disaster, Little was abducted by masked men from his boarding house. He was lynched on a railroad trestle outside of Butte, and a note pinned to his body warned others, "First and last warning." Despite an investigation, the killers were never caught, underscoring the danger faced by labor activists at the time. Meanwhile, the company, claiming wartime necessity, persuaded the federal government to send in troops, imposed martial law, and forced striking miners back to work with few of their demands met. The disaster left a scar on Butte that remains visible today. The Granite Mountain and Speculator Mine Memorial honors the men who perished, with plaques listing the names of all 168 victims and flags representing the 16 nationalities of the miners. Recordings of their last letters, written in the darkness of the tunnels, preserve the voices of those who faced death with courage. The tragedy became a somber lesson in industrial safety, workers' rights, and the human cost of progress, ensuring that the men who went to work that June night would never be forgotten. In the heart of Montana, near the edges of Yellowstone National Park, the Madison River winds through towering pines and rugged canyons. It was a place where families came to camp, fish, and escape the heat of summer. On the night of August 17, 1959, hundreds of people were asleep in tents and trailers along Hebgen Lake and the Madison River, unaware they were directly above one of the most active fault zones in North America. At exactly 11:37 p.m., the earth unleashed a violent tremor that would change the landscape forever. The ground didn't just shake, it tore apart, sending massive rock and soil sliding down the canyon walls. An entire mountainside weighing over 60 million tons was about to crash into the Madison River, creating a new lake in the process. Campers and residents would experience sheer terror as the earth split beneath them, while those lucky enough to be on higher ground watched in disbelief as chaos erupted. This is the story of Montana's Hebgen Lake earthquake, a natural disaster that reshaped the land and left a lasting mark on everyone who witnessed it. August 1959 was peak tourist season in southwestern Montana, and the area around Hebgen Lake was alive with activity. Campers set up along the shore and in the Rock Creek public campground, filling the air with laughter, campfires, and the smell of pine and grilled meals. Families came from across the country to fish the Madison River, hike the surrounding hills, and sleep under the vast Montana sky. Hebgen Lake itself was held back by an earth-filled dam completed in 1914, which had kept the lake stable for decades. The river carved deep canyons that were both beautiful and precarious, with cliffs rising sharply from the water's edge. As evening fell on August 17th, the campers zipped their sleeping bags and settled into trailers, completely unaware of the immense pressure building along the intermountain seismic belt beneath them. The fault lines in the region had been gradually accumulating stress for years, and that night the rock was ready to break. For a few fleeting hours, everything seemed normal, the calm beam before a disaster that would strike in a matter of seconds. At exactly 11:37 p.m. on August 17, 1959, the ground beneath Hebgen Lake ruptured with unimaginable force. The quake registered between 7.2 and 7.3 in magnitude, making it the strongest ever recorded in Montana. For roughly 30 to 40 seconds, the earth bucked, rolled, and twisted, throwing campers and trailers alike into chaos. Sections of U.S. Highway 287 fractured and slid into the lake, cutting off the main route along the Madison River. Fault scarps appeared throughout the area, with the ground dropping as much as 20 feet in some places, creating sudden cliffs where flat ground had existed moments before. The lake itself became unstable, and massive waves, known as a seiche, roared across its surface, some reaching 20 feet in height and surging repeatedly over the Hebgen Dam. Witnesses reported a deafening roar, louder than thunder, as the land shifted violently under their feet. The event reshaped the landscape in an instant, leaving an eerie aftermath that foreshadowed the coming devastation and set the stage for the collapse of an entire mountainside. As the ground continued to shake, the south face of Sheep Mountain, looming over Madison Canyon, suddenly gave way. Over 60 million tons of rock, dirt, and trees broke free and surged down the slope at speeds estimated near 100 miles per hour. The massive landslide completely buried the Madison River and created a temporary dam more than 200 feet high and nearly 3/4 of a mile wide. Debris struck the opposite canyon wall with such force that it propelled trees and boulders hundreds of feet upward. The blast of air generated by the slide was hurricane force, tossing vehicles, trailers, and camping equipment like toys. In its path lay the Rock Creek campground, where dozens of tents and trailers were obliterated, leaving only a small number of survivors. On the edges, the slide forced water out of the river channel, sending a wall of muddy, churning water across the canyon. Within minutes, a peaceful summer night had been transformed into a scene of total devastation, and anyone in the valley had no choice but to face the sudden and violent wrath of nature. In the immediate aftermath of the landslide, campers and families were trapped in total darkness, surrounded by dust, falling debris, and the roar of aftershocks. Many survivors relied purely on luck and quick thinking to escape. Grover and Lillian Malt, a couple in their 70s, clung to a tree as their trailer was swept into the Madison River, holding on for hours in freezing water until morning rescue. Irene Bennett Dunn found herself pinned under a fallen tree, her leg broken, with only her son Phil able to respond to her calls. They were the sole survivors from their family. Other families scrambled to find high ground as waters surged over the riverbanks, while the deafening noise of shifting rock and cascading water drowned out any calls for help. Among the heroes of the night was Nurse Tootie Green, who immediately began treating the injured with what little supplies she had, improvising bandages from towels and clothing in the dark. For many, survival came down to staying calm, assessing the hazards, and helping one another navigate through the chaos. The hours were long, the danger unrelenting, and the landscape forever altered as the quake and slide left its mark on every canyon wall and shoreline. By the morning of August 18th, the full scale of the disaster became clear. The Madison River Canyon was completely isolated, blocked by the massive landslide, and the main highway was destroyed, leaving survivors stranded with no easy escape. Early reports came through a local ham radio operator in West Yellowstone, alerting authorities to the dire situation. Rescue operations began immediately, with the U.S. Forest Service deploying smoke jumpers to parachute into the hazardous area and provide first aid. Helicopter pilots from Hill Air Force Base played a crucial role, landing on unstable ground to evacuate the injured. One pilot, Ray Gerlach, personally rescued 21 people. Bulldozer crews worked around the clock to create a makeshift road to allow additional survivors to reach safety. Officials also realized the landslide had created a natural dam, and water pooling behind it threatened catastrophic flooding downstream, prompting the evacuation of the town of Ennis. These coordinated efforts over the following days were critical in preventing further loss of life and stabilizing the area, setting the stage for engineers to later create a controlled spillway and form what would become Quake Lake. The 1959 Hebgen Lake earthquake left a lasting mark on Montana, claiming 28 lives and causing $11 million in damages, the equivalent of over $119 million today. 19 of the victims were lost in the landslide and their bodies were never recovered. Scientists flocked to the area to study the dramatic fault scarps and massive landslide, gaining a unique opportunity to better understand seismic hazards in the Rocky Mountains. Yellowstone National Park, just next door, also experienced dramatic changes. Dozens of hot springs and geysers became active, some erupting for the first time in recorded history, including Sapphire Pool, which began shooting water more than 150 feet into the air. The natural dam formed by the landslide forced engineers to act quickly, carving a controlled spillway and stabilizing the water level to prevent catastrophic downstream flooding. Quake Lake remains today as both a serene and haunting reminder of that night, with ghostly tree trunks still standing in the water as a testament to the violence of the landslide. The U.S. Forest Service manages the Madison River Canyon earthquake area, and a visitor center on top of the landslide offers panoramic views, while a large boulder with a plaque commemorates those who lost their lives. This disaster, marked by both human tragedy and scientific discovery, continues to teach lessons about the unpredictable power of nature and the resilience of those who survived.